And let's go right to James now. James is in Singapore, and we are in Virginia today. And James, a senior correspondent, as you know, senior correspondent with Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com. Hey, James, great to have you with us, man.
John, as always, pleasure to be with you.
Okay, you got two stories today. I don't know which. I'm going to start with the one that was a week ago, which I read, which I was trying to have you on last week, and I had a couple days off, and I couldn't get set up, so we're a week behind on it. But you have a story flying under the radar, the Iranian alternatives to Suez and Belt and Road. Now, I just want to give here's an example. This is why you go to InsideArabia.com. So James has got the story up how Iran is now linking up with Russia with a train, belt, and shipping road alternative to China. And it's brilliantly written. And I was not aware of any of this. But James, can you share a little insight on what the Iranians here are trying to accomplish?
Sure. Let me start off with something much more broader, which is we perceive of Iran as a Middle Eastern country. And indeed, it is a Middle Eastern country. But it's also part of what I would describe as the greater Middle East, which includes the Caspian Sea, includes the Caucasus, includes Central Asia. And in many ways, Iran, together with Turkey, is a linkage between those parts of one big region. The Iranians, Indians, and the Russians, for about 2 decades, have looked at ways of creating a transportation corridor. For India, it's important because they want to circumvent Pakistan in getting both to Central Asia and to Afghanistan. For the Iranians, it's obviously important because it positions them and cements their position as right in the middle. For the Russians, it's important because Central Asia is their backyard, and because no matter what the relationship is with China, Russia wants to make sure that it has an independent position at the table. So what they've created is a north-south corridor, which means that you would transport by ship from India to Iran, then go by rail to the Caspian, across Iran to the Caspian Sea or to Afghanistan, and from there you would go to a Russian Volga River port, and from there again by train either into Central Asia or all the way into Northern Europe, which essentially is in some way what the Chinese are doing with their railroads that go from Beijing and other places in China all the way into capitals in Europe. So that's the idea. And they've now are really pushing it. And one of the things that they do is, or that they've done, they've reached agreement on a unified bill of lading. Now, that may seem something very simple and straightforward, but it's very important because if you have one invoice all the way from a container port near Mumbai in India to Hamburg in Germany, then you can go with that one invoice, that one bill of lading to a bank and get a letter of credit.
So what are the geopolitical ramifications of what the Iranians are doing? Look, aside from the part that it's a pretty astute move economically, and certainly having the unified bill of lading streamlines the system and allows the transport of the goods through various countries with various stop-offs. But what is the larger geopolitical ramifications? Like, at what point would the Iranian government say, this initiative we did has been a smashing success?
Volume, obviously, is going to make or break success, volume of cargo going through. And there's an issue with that because there's a lot of cargo going out of India, and that would then go through Iran to whatever the destination is. But there's far less coming in, which raises cost. Nonetheless, the Iranians, the Indians, the Russians say that transportation from India to Europe through this channel, through this corridor, would cut expenses by 30 to 40% and time by about 30% as compared to the Suez Canal. So with other words, they are positioning this as a competition to the Suez Canal. Now, in terms of China, what it does is two things. For the Indians, but also for the Iranians, it creates alternatives to the Belt and Road. Or, alternatively, the Chinese could link into this. And in terms of the land route for railways, ultimately, or for trucks from China to Europe, Iran is one central node on that route.
So how does Iran benefit from this directly, James Dorsey?
Well, it benefits from it in two ways. Obviously, there's revenue in this, if indeed it's successful and the volume justifies that. But it also positions Iran as a key country. Iran is the key node in this link between India, Russia, Central Asia, and Europe. And that's obviously, for Iran in the current circumstances, even more important, and it's important in terms of its competition with the Gulf states, but first and foremost, Saudi Arabia.
You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network, Trucking the Truth Across America. We're with James Dorsey, James Senior Correspondent with Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com, the number one site in my mind for covering North Africa, Middle East, and the Gulf. James, let's get to the relationship. This is forging now, enhancing between India and Iran. Obviously, the Indians looking at this initiative and saying, okay, it's going to cut the travel distance by 40%, getting our goods to Europe. That's good. As you just mentioned, it's going to cut costs by 30%. So that puts India, right, in a much better position competing with China, right, if I'm following your logic. India's got to compete with China. So this relationship through Iran gives them a better opportunity to do that because it's cutting off time and cost. But the other thing it does, India has a very good relationship with the United States and through Modi. So now they enhance their trade and relationship with Iran. And how is the U.S. government going to react to that? Because the Trump administration's position, if you follow me, is don't do any business. Nobody does any business with Iran. And now one of your biggest allies is about to embark on a tremendous opportunity with Iran in order to compete with China, which is your other enemy. So the U.S., it's like pick which is worse, right? Pick the poison.
The logic is absolutely correct. The
Thank
reality is not that logic. What I mean with that is, from the U.S. perspective, they're dealing with a regional picture. The regional picture is you have a massive Chinese investment in Pakistan. In fact, the single largest Belt and Road investment country. The crown jewel of that investment is a port in Gwadar, which would basically link the Arabian Sea with Xinjiang. And that is key for the Chinese strategy. The Indians have invested in a port just 70 kilometers up the coastline in Iran, which is Chabahar, which would be the central node for this north-south corridor that we're talking about. When the sanctions were imposed by the Trump administration on Iran, the port of Chabahar was exempted. And the reason why the United States or the Trump administration gave that exemption was that they basically had to weigh various factors. One was Gwadar, the Chinese-backed Pakistani port. The other was their desire to encourage regional trade. And they opted then for exempting Chabahar on a temporary basis from the sanctions. So, with other words, the logic is there, but reality is a very different thing. Now, that doesn't mean that this is not a balancing act for the Indians. It's not only a balancing act with the United States, it's a balancing act with Israel, with which India has very close relations. It's a balancing act with Saudi Arabia, with which India has very close relations. But nonetheless, from an Indian perspective, this is an important port because otherwise they would be dependent on a long way round, or alternatively on a Chinese-backed port in a country that is not very cooperative with India.
It's kind of money talks, nobody walks here type of thing. If I could get it down to the basic level,
the way I would put it is, you can have broad ideals, whatever one thinks of them, agrees or doesn't agree. Reality on the ground is often very different, and it's the reality you have to deal with, and you have to make choices.
And the choice here for the Indians is the route through Iran provides them on the ground with much better opportunities, and they're competing with China. Now, let's get to Russians. How does this impact them, and where do they stand on this?
Well, the Russians have been fairly frustrated, even though they have not really said that publicly, that very little of the transportation corridors, if any, that go from China to Europe through parts of the Middle East or through Central Asia go through Russia. And Russia what is Central Asia? What is this greater Middle East? It's actually Eurasia. So, with other words, it's the heartland of what increasingly is becoming one continent, Europe and Asia. And the Russians want, they occupy the center of that, and they obviously want to leverage it.
In their economic reality, right? So if you're Putin now and you're looking at this, do you prefer that India increase their trade vis-a-vis China, or are you more comfortable, or do you care? Does that factor into this?
Of course you care. I think from the Russian point of view, look, you cannot ignore China. They have a border. There's the Far East of Russia, and China is a very important trade and partner on multiple other issues. Having said that, the Soviet Union has a long-standing relationship with India. Two, Central Asia is Russia's backyard, and the assumption was for a number of years now that there was a division of labor between Russia and China. Russia would take care of security in Central Asia. China would take care of economics. Now, what's happening is that balance is shifting. The Chinese, obviously, there's a huge economic investment that makes countries more dependent, or in any case, more lenient towards China. And there's also Chinese moves into security issues, particularly in countries like Afghanistan, like Tajikistan. And the Russians are very nervous about that. So what this gives them is, it gives them some degree of independence in their relationship with China, and it obviously gives them a much stronger seat at the table if it all works.
This is really fascinating. So the other thing that the Iranians have done here, and you point this out in your piece, very astutely, I should say, James. By the way, this is a fabulous piece, just as a sidebar. You got to read this. Go to InsideArabia.com. This is really a fabulous piece. And they also have a map with it, so you can kind of see how this all lays out, which is very well done. But it's a very insightful piece. And the title of it, so just so everybody knows, is Flying Under the Radar, Iranian Alternatives to Suez and Belt and Road from the Chinese. Very insightful piece and very well laid out, and in a way that even a layman can understand, because a lot of this stuff is, you got acronyms in there like INSTC and all, but you can really understand this. But what's fascinating what Iran has done is they've created this trade opportunity to take advantage of the immediate need of India, but they've not closed the door to making China part of this, right?
No,
Explain that.
Explain that. So, with other words, China has built what it's called multiple corridors that are basically transportation routes from China to Europe. In fact, the very first transcontinental train that left China several years ago went to Tehran. And there's a regular train connection, that carries goods back and forth. Now, what I'm arguing is that if China wanted, it could build the north-south corridor into one of its corridors and could have a hookup with that. The Iranians obviously would not be opposed to that. The Russians certainly would not be opposed to that. I'm not sure what the Indians at this point would feel about it. But ultimately, the Indians and the Chinese are going to have to come to some arrangement, and then this would make sense to make it part of. But I think the main issue here for the Russians, the Indians, and the Iranians is an alternative to China, rather than an integration of China into the corridor.
Right, but the strategic brilliance of what the Iranians have done here, and you pointed out, is they've taken advantage of the immediate need of India and India's desire to compete with the Chinese and to get their goods moved, save costs, make it quicker. But in so doing, this is not a move for the Iranians against the Chinese. They've kept all the doors open for future integration. Brilliantly done.
That's correct.
No question.
The only caveat on that is it's the Iranians, the Russians, and the Indians. It's not the Iranians alone, and the Iranians could not do it on their own. I mean, the Iranians are maybe the central node,
right,
but they need the whole thing integrated for it to work. So this is something, again, it was, the original idea is 2 decades old, but this is something that the Iranians, alongside the Russians and the Indians, are pushing. It's not something the Iranians could pull off on their own. So they all three deserve credit.
James, final question. Go to InsideArabia.com. James Dorsey, final question. In the short term, what has the pandemic done to making this grow a future reality? What impact has that had on this?
Well, obviously the pandemic across the globe has battered economies. So levels of trade have gone down. The ability to move is curtailed. And that will have an impact. Now, having said that, there still is a lot of trade and will continue and ultimately will grow. And so you may be starting from lower levels as India, Russia, Iran try to recover from the various economic issues, including the fallout of the pandemic that they have to grapple with. But frankly, that's true for everybody, whether it's China or the United States or anything in between.
Outstanding piece. We're out of time. I want to thank James Dorsey for being with us live in Singapore, 12 hours difference. James, I mean, you always do good pieces, but this piece is especially insightful. I learned so much. I had to read it like 5 times. Flying Under the Radar, Iranian Alternatives to Suez and Belt and Road by James Dorsey. Go to Inside Arabia. I'm telling you, I've been telling you guys this for months now, and I'm spot on. As always, go to InsideArabia.com. InsideArabia.com. It is the source for news and analysis of the Middle East, the Gulf, and North Africa. You're going to get stuff on there you just don't get anywhere else. InsideArabia.com. James Dorsey. James, thanks for being with us on this Friday Live in Singapore, James. Thank you.
John, it's always fun to talk to you.